My name is Matt Ray, and I'm an experienced team leader here at the Sazerac House in New Orleans, Louisiana. The Sazerac House is a home place and a welcome center of the Sazerac Company based here in New Orleans. The Sazerac House is an interactive cocktail museum. It is a working distillery, an event space, and a gift shop located at Canal and Magazine Streets in downtown New Orleans. And we opened last October of 2019. So I hope you get to come visit us. Today, we're gonna be talking about the history of rye whiskey. We're gonna have a whiskey tasting with our head distiller, David Bock, who in a few minutes is actually gonna take you on a tour of our working distillery here at the Sazerac House, where we were making Sazerac rye whiskey. So a really quick background of rye whiskey. Rye was mostly born in the Northeast in the United States of America. So it was considered for a long time that people brought rye to eat and then whatever was left over was used to make whiskey. That's probably not true. What's more likely true is that they grew corn and wheat for food, and when the food supply was stable, they grew rye specifically to distill. And it was considered much more popular to grow rye for whiskey because honestly, people thought it tasted a lot better. So in New Orleans, we were French, and then a Spanish, a French again, and then finally an American city when Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And as a result of that French and Spanish influence, we really preferred Madeira, wine, brandy, and a more expensive version of brandy cognac in New Orleans for a long time. So it would be a while before rye whiskey would really catch on here. But there would be a couple of things that would change that. One, in the 1800s, taste would change here in the Crescent City. As fewer and fewer French and Spanish descendants were growing up in the city and more Americans were flooding in and making it one of the most populous cities in America, taste changed to whiskey, and specifically to rye whiskey, which was super popular in the country, especially in the South, outside of Kentucky. And again, Kentucky, they had their own whiskey. It was mostly corn. So rye whiskey, super popular in the South, but it would take a while to catch on in New Orleans. But the other thing that would change that would be the invention of the steamboat. The steamboat would basically turn the Mississippi into an easy pathway between Pennsylvania and New Orleans into a super highway. And believe it or not, it was actually easier for distillers and farmers in Western Pennsylvania that were making Monongahela rye whiskey on the Monongahela River to take their whiskey by barge boat or by the kind of cigar box boats down to Cairo, Illinois, down the Ohio River, and then finally to New Orleans, because it was honestly a lot easier than taking a pack mule 300 miles to the coast to sell their products that people weren't really that excited about. Enter Thomas Handy. Thomas Handy was an entrepreneur, a veteran, a liquor dealer, and a business owner. So in New Orleans, he took over the Sazerac House from the previous owner when he died. So the Sazerac House was advertised in 1871 when Thomas Handy took it over and renamed the business as importer of fine Sazerac brandy. So again, we talked about that New Orleans was a city of brandy lovers and cognac lovers. So by 1843, it was already common to find a brandy cocktail in the city. So brandy cocktails had a long history in the city, and it was already pretty common if you went to a hotel and asked for a brandy cocktail, or a thing vulgarly called a cocktail. You could ask also for a cul de chanticleer, composed of brandy, absinthe, sugar, bitters, and ice, according to a Times-Picayune article at the time. If you wanted to look extra fancy, they encouraged you to speak in French and English so you could show off how cultured you were in New Orleans. Thomas Handy either had the great responsibility or the great pleasure, or depending on your point of view, the great burden of finding a replacement for the brandy and cognac when it started to become hard to get and prohibitively expensive in the 1870s. As a reminder, there was phylloxera happening in Europe. Phylloxera was an aphid infestation that destroyed a lot of the grapevines in Europe. If you can't grow grapes, you can't make wine. If you can't make wine, you can't make brandy or cognac. So prices in New Orleans started steadily creeping up, and even the famous Sazerac cognac that the Sazerac House served was becoming kind of prohibitively expensive and hard to get. So the Sazerac House had a house cocktail that wouldn't have a name called the Sazerac until the 1890s. But Thomas Handy was from Maryland. And Maryland at that time was famous for a kind of sweet, slightly spicy version of rye whiskey that was much different than the Monongahela rye that a lot of the other country was drinking. So Maryland is further south, they had access to more corn, so there was a lot more corn in their mash. Pre-phylloxera cognac had 3 different grapes, or at least the Sazerac cognac did, and it gave it kind of a sweet, slightly spicy flavor. So Thomas Handy, being from Maryland, traded this sweet, slightly spicy pre-phylloxera cognac with a spicy, slightly sweet rye whiskey from his home state of Maryland, and that would be the next step in the evolution of what would become the Sazerac cocktail. The Sazerac cocktail would be branded and one of the first branded cocktails at the turn of the century in the early 1900s at the Sazerac House. New Orleans has always had a kind of a stubborn love of rye whiskey, and even in the darkest days of rye following Prohibition, and even probably the darker days of the 1970s and 1980s in the whiskey industry, New Orleans has kind of stubbornly held on to its love of one of the greatest rye traditions in the entire world. Today, Sazerac Rye is the most award-winning rye whiskey in the world since 2005, and we're really proud to be making it here at the Sazerac House. The Sazerac Company was one of the first major companies to heavily invest in rye whiskey, and they've been investing and reinvesting every year since the Buffalo Trace Distillery opened in 1999. We are proud to say that there is more Sazerac rye being made now than ever before. So now I'm going to introduce you to David Bock. David Bock is our head distiller here at the Sazerac House, where he's making Sazerac rye whiskey and actually Peychaud's bitters too. And he's going to give you a tour of our working distillery.
Thanks, Matt. Like you said, my name's David Bock. I'm the head distiller here at the Sazerac House. What that means is I'm the head of all distillation and production here at the Sazerac House. How did I get to this title or this position? I had to work my way up, as you would imagine, to get here. I started at different distilleries, sweeping floors, mopping, doing shipping and receiving, cleaning tanks, cleaning out stills, pressure washing, finally getting to ferment, learning about fermentations, learning about distillations, learning about what it takes to get good distillations, clean, crisp cuts. All that, all those years combined were able to bring me to this position and this title here at the Sazerac House. What we do here is we actually make Sazerac rye whiskey. You're standing in the distillery. We use rye, corn, and barley. For it to be a rye whiskey, it has to be at least 51% rye grains. We're not going to tell you exactly what's in that mash bill. We like to keep that close to the chest. The rye grains look just like this, right? I wish that we could grow them here in New Orleans, but we can't. It's too hot. We can grow humidity and we can grow mosquitoes, but we can't grow rye grains. Rye grains we have to get from up north. They come from the Dakotas, the Minnesotas, and Canada. Canada's a great cold place as well that we can get rye grains. The other two primary grains, like I said, are corn and barley. If we were making bourbon, we would kind of switch this around, right? So corn would be our primary grain, and then rye, and then barley. But we're making rye whiskey, so that rye is really gonna be the standout piece. You'll notice that it's the standout piece when we do our tasting later, because you'll get those spicy notes that the rye provides and that kind of peppery taste. But let's start first with the fermentation. Let's walk up to that fermentation vessel. All right, so we've talked about the grains. Now we're moving on to fermentations. Those grains will come up through an auger, down through this tube right here, into our fermentation vessel, or our cooker, right? And we kind of do both in this distillery. What's inside here will be warm water. The grains and the warm water will mix. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to pull apart that carbohydrate molecule. Once we get that carbohydrate molecule, we'll break it using different enzymes. When we break the carbohydrate molecule, it turns it into simple and complex sugars. That's really what we want, is we want a sugary sweet mess to be inside this cooker. When we're doing that, it kind of smells like bread, like we're baking bread in the distillery. That's the kind of aroma that's coming off of these cookers. So what we'll do is we'll cook those grains. Once we get it down, and then we'll start to cool them to get it to what the temperature is that yeast likes to live at or propagate at. Once we get the cooker down to the right temperature, we'll throw the yeast in, and the yeast will start eating all those sugars. And then it'll make booze and bubbles, CO2 and ethanol. So if you look inside this tank, what you'll see inside here is what we call krausen, or curly hair. You'll see the yeast eating the sugars and producing CO2 and bubbling and curling around and making all these great, gorgeous bubbles that you know that you have a really healthy fermentation. That's really what you want from the fermentation process. So after about 3 to 5 days, we'll produce as much alcohol, that yeast will produce as much alcohol as we can out of these tanks. From there, we'll send it over to our still, which is the next spot on this walk. Let's go that way now. All right, so we have made what we call a distiller's beer, right? Now what we need to do is we need to get the alcohol out of it. The easiest way to do that is through distillation. Alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water. Alcohol boils at 178 and water boils at 212. So what we're gonna do is we're going to send it into Lucille, what we've lovingly nicknamed the still behind me. The reason we nicknamed her Lucille was after we set her up, we ran a test run and we found that up on the second floor, there was a loose seal that we had to fix, which was quite taxing, but enjoyable, and it gave us a great name to give the still. So we send the wash into the kettle, which is a stainless steel part on the bottom. Above that, you'll see the round bulbous area, that's called the onion, and then it goes into our column. For Sazerac rye, we found that about 4 plates gives us the flavor profile that we're looking for. So each one of those portholes that you see in the still are a plate. What's gonna happen is we're gonna heat up the wash and it's gonna turn into a vapor. That vapor is gonna hit that plate. The plate's not as hot as the vapor, so it's gonna condense into a liquid and drop back down. That's called reflux. Once the plate gets the same temperature as the liquid, it's gonna allow it to go through a tube past a bubble cap and up to the next level. We're breaking the spirit apart, right? We're getting a cleaner and more pure spirit. We're not gonna use all the plates because we're not trying to make vodka. We're trying to make a good rounded spirit, and we found that it takes only a couple of plates to get that product. So we'll turn this still on, we'll heat it up, that vapor will start coming across all the way up to the top and then come and collect in our collection tanks. The first run of that is called low wines. It's low proof alcohol. It's the beginning of great alcohol, but you really wouldn't want to drink it. It needs more refinement, right? So we'll fill up a whole tank and we'll put it back in the still. And that second run, we'll do the exact same process. It'll go right through those 4 plates again, up to the condensers, which will condense it from a vapor back to a liquid, send it back down to our collection tanks. And by that point, it'll come across in 3 phases, right? So on that second run, that high wines run, went from low wines to high wines, comes across in 3 phases. You have the heads, the hearts, and the tails. For heads, think about, that's like very volatile chemicals. That's more like your acetone, your fingernail polish remover. That's really what comes across first. After that is the hearts, that's the good whiskey. That's the stuff we want to keep and we want to collect. And the tails is when you're getting too close to the boiling point of water and you're getting more water coming across than whiskey, and it's no longer efficient to continue to run the still. So we'll keep that and try to keep the tails in the still. All right, so we have a whole tank full of good hearts. Those hearts are high proof in about 165. And we need to get it down to barrel entry strength for our barrel, which is 125. So we'll add water, bring it down to barrel strength, and put it in these barrels. These barrels are made out of American white oak. There's a char number 4, and it's also called alligator char because if you look, it kind of has scales or flakes. What'll happen inside this barrel is this is where that whiskey will pick up its color. A good amount of flavor will also happen inside this as that whiskey pushes into the wood and gets compressed out of it. All that happens inside this barrel. As you see, we're here in New Orleans and we don't have a ton of space. I don't have space to keep years and years of barrels. So what I'll do is I'll get about a tractor trailer load. I'll send it back to Kentucky where it'll age in their rick houses. After 6 years, we'll take it out of the rick and they'll filter it and drain it. And then they'll send it to us to be bottled. When you were talking to Matt Ray earlier, he was actually standing in front of the bottling line that we have here at the Sazerac House. So all Sazerac rye that is bought here at the Sazerac House is actually bottled right there, right behind Matt. So now the fun part, let's go meet Matt Ray and have a tasting of some of the ryes that we have in our portfolio. What we have here is we have a flight set up. Thank you for joining me again, Matt Ray. A flight setup of different rye whiskeys that are in the Buffalo Trace portfolio. The first one to talk about is Sazerac rye. This is our 6-year-old rye whiskey. It's very approachable. It's the official rye whiskey for the Sazerac cocktail. What else can we say about it?
I used to be a cocktail bartender for a long time, and it was the gold standard for cocktails. We used it in pretty much anything that called for rye whiskey. So everything from an old fashioned to Manhattan, we used Sazerac rye.
And then the other two that we're going to be trying today are actually part of Buffalo Trace's antique collection. They're the Sazerac 18 and the Thomas Handy. And how are we going to be tasting those today, Matt?
So a lot of times you would do a tasting and you would do it in chronological order. And the idea is that you would start with younger and go older and hopefully get deeper and deeper complexity and maybe more oak as you go. In this case, we're kind of mixing it up a little bit. We're starting with that Sazerac Rye 6-year first, then we're going to the Sazerac 18, but we're ending with Thomas Handy because it's an uncut, unfiltered, barrel strength whiskey. It tops in at over 125 proof. So it is a, kind of kick in the teeth. It is full-bodied, rich, and will probably blow out our palates afterwards. There's honestly not a lot of whiskey flights that you can have at home that are just barrel strength whiskeys, because most people's palates can't take that much alcohol at once. So we're just gonna end on a high note.
Ease into it. Ease into that barrel strength. All right, well, let's get going. Let's start with the Sazerac Rye whiskey. What I love about this is the pepperiness that comes all across with the Sazerac Rye. It's really nice, it's really smooth. It's very, like we say, it's like an everyday rye whiskey to try to drink and use. What else you got, Matt?
Just like clove and a little bit of ginger, honestly.
Ginger, I can see that, I can definitely see that. All right, let's move on to that antique collection and the 18-year-old. So now we're just jumping way ahead in time and going 18 years up. The nose is different on this, right? We're gonna get a lot more oak, and you would expect that because it sat in the barrel for much longer.
The other thing to point out is not only does it sit in the barrel and get more of those oak and tannins, so I get a lot of tannins, but there's also active oxidation that's happening with the interaction of the whiskey and the air that's inside the barrel. So the flavors in that first 6 year are maturing and changing a lot.
Right, I taste like leather, right? You get that leather coming across, you get some molasses in there as well. It's really, and then it also coats your tongue more than the Sazerac Rye had previously.
It's definitely a little bit richer than the Sazerac Rye. The other cool thing that's happening is that like the floral notes that were in that first whiskey have kind of transitioned to like higher herbal, like mint notes, almost like eucalyptus.
Yeah, eucalyptus, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that one. All right, let's go for that barrel strength. So now we're going straight for the, what proof did you say it was?
Let's see, this particular expression is 125.7.
Yeah, all right. So the alcohol comes straight across in the nose, right? You can smell that it's different than that 18. There's that higher proof than you were previously. Yeah, with this Handy, it's more toffee, right? It's kind of, I don't know, what you got there?
This is one of my favorite whiskeys in the world, but this one is like so rich and mouth coating. Like it completely takes over your whole palate, but you definitely get those ginger notes that are evident in the regular 6 year Sazerac Rye whiskey. But yeah, pretty much it's all of the notes that you want in a rye whiskey. I don't know, words escape me when it gets to this level of being very.
I think it's different because it is so much more higher proof, right? Different pieces come out of the rye whiskey that you wouldn't find in other expressions of this same juice, like Matt was saying. You kind of get those to come through when you get that higher proof and when you get the small nuances. It's just weird how those little things can change just by changing the proof of this and by obviously changing the ages of each one as well.
That this whiskey, if you are able to get a bottle, it's for drinking. And if you can,
absolutely,
to drink it with friends as soon as possible. Our head tour guide at Buffalo Trace Distillery, Freddie Johnson, will tell you that there's always gonna be more whiskey, but those moments with like family and friends are really precious. So if you can crack one of these open with your family and friends, you absolutely should.
Well, this was a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you all for showing up. We really hope you can come to the Sazerac House and see us. Come take a tour, come take a class with Matt. Come see me in the distillery, get the smells and the taste and everything. With that, drink responsibly, drive responsibly, come see me and Matt. And I think that's it.
Yep.
All right,
cool.
See y'all.